From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. As Parliament returned on Monday, the government seemed determined to hit the ground running with a series of policy announcements, some of global significance.
Mr. Speaker, as concern at the horrifying scenes in Gaza has risen, many in this House, as well as esteemed lawyers and international organisations, have raised British arms export licensing to Israel.
In his first appearance as Foreign Secretary in the House of Commons, David Lammy addressed an issue that he'd campaigned on in opposition. After launching a review of the legal advice on exporting arms to Israel over the summer, he'd now come to a decision.
It is with regret that I inform the House today the assessment I have received leaves me unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
So what will this partial ban mean for Israel and the UK? And for the government, will it ward off a brewing rebellion within its own party? The Story today: the UK bans some arms sales to Israel. But what difference will it make?
I'm Aubrey Allegretti, the Chief Political Correspondent for The Times.
Aubrey, Parliament is back this week. Westminster's suddenly abuzz again. And it began with a major announcement from David Lammy. Just describe the moment in Parliament.
Yes, it was back to school day for most MPs, and they're still settling in, actually. There was a great deal of almost levity earlier in the day, but as the day progressed, the government sources that I was speaking to were increasingly confident that some sort of arms suspension was going to be announced. And it was a really solemn moment in the chamber.
And so I've made this decision with regret. It's in sorrow, not in anger.
One of those rare occasions when every word really matters, and you know that governments across the world are watching. And so there was actually very civil exchanges over the dispatch boxes from MPs. And it was later on, after the government published the document summarising its legal advice and more details about the decision, that the criticism started to mount.
This was a very urgent announcement on the first day back. That will partly have been because, obviously, during the summer, in recess, the war in the Middle East hasn't stopped. There are reasons to want to come to a decision on this quite quickly. Is there also a sense, though, that for Labour, this is something they want to try and see off before Labour Party conference, where there could be trouble over this issue?
Yeah, Keir Starmer has really struggled, I suppose, to hold the various wings of the parliamentary party together on this issue. They were incredibly united in opposition, but actually the issue that caused them the most trouble was their stance on a ceasefire in Gaza. There was a vote held in the House of Commons, and at that point, the Labour leadership hadn't reached that specific position. They were calling for temporary pauses in the fighting in order to allow humanitarian aid in, but they were not comfortable at that point aligning themselves with the permanent position of a ceasefire, which was a major source of disgruntlement.
There is nothing humanitarian about letting children eat a little today only to bomb them tomorrow. The only humanitarian way forward is an immediate ceasefire.
And so when there was a vote held, it forced at least 5 Labour frontbenchers to quit the shadow cabinet.
Jess Phillips, the most high profile of all these resignations, she has said this in a letter to Sir Keir Starmer: "I must vote with my constituents, my head and my heart, which has felt as if it were breaking over the horror of the situation in Israel and Palestine."
The first sort of major rebellion that Keir Starmer faced at that time. And in the months since, he has come under even greater pressure, not least because at the general election, Labour really struggled to attract the support of Muslim voters. It saw wafer-thin majorities in seats held by Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips, who had previously enjoyed quite healthy majorities. And it also saw the ejection of some Labour MPs, the most notable being John Ashworth in Leicester.
The former Labour attack dog and shadow and pension secretary was beaten in Leicester South by Shaukat Adam, an independent who said his victory was for the people of Gaza.
There was such strong sort of rallying support amongst senior members of the Muslim community who accused Labour of effectively abandoning those people. So Muslim voters really had a very strong voice in this election.
So that's the politics, with pressure mounting from the backbenchers for something to be done about the war in Gaza. But it's been a complicated process turning that into policy. For a guide to how we got here, we turn to our man in Whitehall.
My name is George Grylls. I'm a defence and politics correspondent at The Times. Slightly weird title, but talking about arms sales to Israel is right in the middle of the Venn diagram of my two briefs. Really.
Defence and politics. Tell us about some of the defence rumblings in Whitehall last week when the Attorney General weighed in on the subject of arms exports to Israel.
Yeah, so the Attorney General's quite an interesting character and was in many ways a surprise appointment to Keir Starmer's cabinet. He's not got a political background. He's quite similar to Keir Starmer in that they both came to politics later in life. Remember, Keir Starmer had a quite long legal career, and particularly an international legal career. You know, he was working in The Hague, and Richard Hermer worked with Keir Starmer when they were both junior barristers at Doughty Street Chambers, which is a very prestigious chambers that deals with human rights law. But he also has a personal connection to Israel. He's talked in the past about how he has dear family who have been serving in the IDF, who are Israeli. But at the same time, he has been critical about the Israeli government. And indeed, in the aftermath of October the 7th, he was one of the signatories of a letter of prominent Jewish lawyers who are warning Israel not to kind of overstep the mark and breach international humanitarian law in their response to those Hamas terror attacks. So Richard Hermer was made a peer and sort of drafted straight into the cabinet. Specifically in relation to British policy towards Israel, he is becoming a more vocal presence, certainly within the government. And that extends to the fact that he has personally made visits to Israel and has been doing some of the diplomacy on behalf of the government. And now on the question of arms sales to Israel, he has become involved basically in the legal process in Whitehall and is basically saying to the Foreign Office that you can only ban certain weapons if you can prove that they have been used to commit acts that may have broken international humanitarian law.
That is fascinating. So he's clearly playing a key part in all of this. It's not the first time there have been tensions across Whitehall because of this issue. Just a few weeks ago, there was a resignation that hit the headlines. Take us back to that moment and just remind us of what happened.
This was a fairly junior diplomat in Dublin called Mark Smith. I think he was second secretary for counter-terrorism, but he had a background in working on this arms export licensing regime, and particularly in the Middle East, and he basically sent a round-robin email across the Foreign Office.
Mark Smith's resignation letter was leaked online. He said within it that the Foreign Office may be complicit in war crimes because of the continuing sale of arms to Israel. He explained his belief when we spoke a few moments ago.
When you look at what constitutes a war crime, it's actually quite clear that the state of Israel is perpetrating war crimes in plain sight.
To kind of resign in such a public fashion is unusual, and it's not the first time that we've had kind of Whitehall grumblings about this. There was almost a threat of strike action in the Department of Business earlier this year, so there's clearly a relatively junior level, it must be said, but there's clearly some unhappiness and unrest within the civil service. The problem is that it's a much more difficult issue than it sounds initially, and part of that is related to what Britain actually sells to Israel.
It is a much more complicated issue, and we're relying on you to simplify it for us, I fear. Most of us don't know the ins and outs of what we actually export to Israel. So just stepping back, give us a sense of the value of arms that the UK is selling to Israel every year.
We actually buy more arms from Israel than we sell, and it's a pretty puny amount that we sell, given that Israel is a major military power. Last year, it was £18.2 million was the exports to Israel. The year before, it was £42 million. So if we take that 2023 figure, that equates to, and I did the calculation and nearly got it wrong because my maths is a little bit rusty, but I made it out that it's 0.001% of total Israeli defense spending.
Really? As tiny as that?
It's really very, very insignificant.
Where are they getting the bulk of their weapons from?
Well, firstly, they have a domestic industry that's pretty robust. If you look at, for example, the Merkava tanks that have been used in Gaza, those are Israeli-produced tanks. Apart from that, it's basically the US and Germany that sell all the arms to Israel.
And in terms of what we are supplying, what have we been sending to Israel?
I think it's worth kind of going through the whole process of how it works. Basically, if you are a business that exports goods, there is basically a huge booklet. It's almost 400 pages long of weapons or things that could potentially be used as weapons. If the good that you want to export is on that list, you have to apply to the government for a license to export it. And when it comes to countries that the UK has a less good relationship with, so, I don't know, North Korea or Russia, it's just not going to happen. But with Israel, basically, the bulk of it concerns the F-35 fighter jet. This is a stealth fighter plane, basically the most modern aircraft that is used across the world by different militaries. And it's an American aircraft for which the British make certain components. Campaigners have said that the UK makes up to 15% of each aircraft. British companies make, for example, the ejector seat or some of the machinery that's used to unlock the doors that carry the bombs on the plane. So the UK contributes a bit, but the UK lobbied to contribute that amount when they started to buy American aircraft. And the F-35 has been used for bombing raids over Gaza. But the consequences, for example, of saying the UK is going to stop producing parts for the F-35, how many jobs that would sacrifice in parts of the UK that are traditionally Labour usually. There is also the question, what would be the consequences for the UK's own defence and the UK's Air Force? Because the F-35 is a crucial part of what the future of UK defences look like.
So this is how it becomes more complicated when you are the Defence Secretary or the Foreign Secretary. Suddenly it's not that you can just isolate the F-35s that are going to Israel and not provide parts for those. You have no idea which ones are going to be sent. You have to stop providing parts to the F-35, something which the defence industry in Britain fought really hard to be able to have a role in. And that jeopardises the future of the F-35 for all of us. I mean, that's a real tangle. Has the UK government stopped arms to Israel in the past?
Yes, and frequently. Margaret Thatcher in 1982, during the Lebanese war, she removed arms sales. Tony Blair again in 2002, I think that was over Gaza. Gordon Brown, 2009, that was specifically naval guns being used to attack Gaza. David Cameron again in 2014. So there's a long history of doing it. It usually tends to be for specific things. And I think that naval guns example from 2009 is a good example where, clearly the government at the time thought that what was being exported was being used in something that could not be justified. And therefore they removed the license for that specific thing.
There's a direct line between them receiving naval guns and using them to batter Gaza.
Correct.
What are the criteria that they normally use? What are the humanitarian criteria you use to work out whether you should be supplying weapons to a country or not?
Well, this is where it's actually a bit woolly. So when you actually look through the criteria, they're pretty broad. And yes, one of them is the UK will not sell arms to a country where there's a clear risk, I think is the words, that it could be used to break international law. But another criteria is saying that they have to factor in whether or not providing arms to this country could prolong a conflict. And given that the UK has been calling for a ceasefire for, over 6 months, you could argue that the continued supply of arms to Israel would count as prolonging that conflict. So even though it's framed as a legal process, I think there is a hell of a lot of politics basically at the heart of it.
George, take us back to April, when the argument around whether we should be supplying arms to Israel really started to gain momentum. It suddenly became a national issue.
I would actually go a little bit further back. I go to January, I go to the ICJ ruling on the South Africa case.
Just to run through what Judge Joan E. Donoghue said, she ordered that Israel must take all measures within its powers to prevent any genocidal acts. It must ensure there are no statements that could be seen as incitement to genocide.
Almost more important was how it was interpreted, which was that there is a plausible risk of genocide, which is arguably wrong. But that led to people questioning why Britain was supplying arms to Israel, given there was this potential for war crimes. There was a petition that gained over 100,000 signatures. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the time, Alicia Cairns, she was one of those who said, particularly in the aftermath of a strike on aid workers that killed 7 people, including British citizens, she's pointed to that as a line in the sand.
So I believe we have no choice but to suspend arms sales. And it's important the public understands this isn't a political decision, as some seem to want to present it as. Legal advice is advisory, so the government can choose to reject it. But UK arms export licences require a recipient to comply with international humanitarian law.
It's been growing clamour from campaigners for an arms embargo.
At the time when that clamour was growing, you had a Conservative government in power. How did they respond to it?
Well, their decision was to basically stay with the status quo. David Lammy, in opposition, he was pressing for the publication of the legal advice on Gaza and how weapons were being used in Gaza.
Of course they've got concerns about proportionality, but the only person that can answer that is David Cameron, because he's the only person that's received advice. Apparently, he said he was about to receive advice at the beginning of March. It's weeks later, publish a summary of advice, because this is hugely important that the United Kingdom is not complicit at all in a breach of humanitarian international law.
But the Conservative Party was pretty close and pretty vehement in its support for Israel. And I think the case against Netanyahu and the fact that they were basically delaying the arrest warrant proceedings, that was a good example of how...
The International Criminal Court decision.
Because the UK was going out on a limb. The ICC announced that it was perhaps going to look at pursuing Hamas leaders and Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, and Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, for potential war crimes. The UK, under the Conservative government, filed a legal petition to question whether it had jurisdiction over that, which had the effect of basically blocking the case or delaying the case. And Israel looked favourably upon that. And Netanyahu personally was very invested in that, because the consequences of it, if he did actually proceed to a trial, would be that he couldn't really travel to, for example, the UK or any other signatories of the ICC without stepping off a plane and immediately being put in handcuffs. So the US is not a signatory. So this was where the UK
became the only country
that could do it. That was an example where the UK was useful to Israel, because I think quite often we overestimate the influence that the UK has over Israel. But that was a case where it was, because, they couldn't rely on the US.
At the time, as you say, David Lammy, as shadow Foreign Secretary, was demanding to see the legal evidence. He was demanding it should be published so that everybody would see it.
Well, I mean, you can even go further as well. When he was in opposition, David Lammy said in relation to the Rafah offensive, he said if any weapons have been used there, then we should suspend arms sales to Israel. So he specifically called for it. The problem is, as he's I suspect, discovered in government, it is very, very hard to ascertain which weapons have been used where in Gaza and tie them to war crimes. Bear in mind that no journalists have been allowed in. Reporting is pretty patchy. And the idea that officials in Whitehall can establish beyond all reasonable doubt that this weapon that was exported by this British company was used in this attack is just mind-bogglingly complicated.
And George, apart from this new announcement on the ban on some arms sales to Israel, what else has the government been doing differently to the Conservatives?
Well, one of the most important moves that the government has done in relation to British policy towards Israel since the election was no longer standing in the way of the ICC arrest warrant proceedings for Benjamin Netanyahu. And
so they're upholding the decision by the ICC against key figures in the Israeli government as well as Hamas.
Correct, yeah. I mean, they're allowing it to happen. They're not standing in the way. They restored funding to UNRWA, which was the Palestinian main sort of aid agency run by the UN. You might recall Israel accused workers and employees of UNRWA of being Hamas members and being involved in the October 7th attack, at which point a number of countries withdrew their funding, including the UK. I would argue that arms sales to Israel is a pretty symbolic gesture given how small those sales are. It will not affect how Israel prosecutes the war, but I would argue of the diplomatic levers they can pull, the one they have threatened to do, and actually I would say they've resiled from it so far, and I think they will continue to do so, is recognition of a Palestinian state. And that was something that David Lammy said, why isn't the government doing this now? And the emphasis was on now. And now the language has softened and they talk about it's coming basically at the end of a two-state solution process, pushing it further back in the process rather than kick-starting it, which is where they appeared to be earlier in the year.
Well, it's now a good almost 8 months since we've been calling for an immediate ceasefire. And under those circumstances, we can work with others because Palestinian recognition is not the end in of itself. It is actually a two-state solution that is the end in of itself that we want to achieve.
Aubrey, we've had this announcement from David Lammy now. It's a partial ban on weapons sales. We know it's already annoyed the Israeli government. We've heard from the Israeli defense minister who says he's deeply disheartened. Does this mean, is this the UK government basically saying that they've found evidence of international humanitarian law being broken?
So no, it's important to say that ministers stress that they are not saying that Israel has broken international humanitarian law. And that's partly because they think it's not the government's job to make that decision.
This government is not an international court. We have not and could not arbitrate on whether or not Israel has breached international humanitarian law. This is a forward-looking evaluation, not a determination of innocence or guilt.
They are trying to draw a distinction and say that there is a very strict set of criteria about which countries and for which weapons export licenses can be granted for arms sales, and that they have found 30 instances where there is enough evidence that supplying these arms could be used by Israel in commencement of attacks on civilians. And David Lammy said that he was unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. So it's almost trying to precipitate how they might be used rather than sort of casting a judgment necessarily on how they have been used.
Third, this is not a blanket ban. This is not an arms embargo. It targets around 30, approximately 350 licenses to Israel in total for items which could be used in the current conflict in Gaza. The rest will continue.
Just explain exactly what is being banned. What are the 30 export licenses? What do we know about them?
The decision is quite wide-ranging, and it covers effectively tools and components for things like fighter aircraft, helicopters and drones, other equipment for hitting targets on the ground in Gaza. But importantly, it doesn't cover tools or aspects which are part of F-35 jets. And that's because the UK effectively supplies those tools into a global pool, and they're used by the UK's allies, including NATO. And so it's harder then for ministers to be able to distinguish where those parts are going and who they're being used by. So that's quite an important carve out. And of course, it's worth thinking about the wider political decision here. The government could have decided to unilaterally suspend all arms sales to Israel, deciding that it wasn't good to be facilitating doing business with a country that it felt might be using these tools in this way. And it hasn't done that. So it's chosen, if you like, a middle path.
And in his statement, David Lammy, whilst he was announcing this partial ban on Israel, he also had real criticism for Iran.
Yes, certainly. And I think the UK is only too aware that Iran is viewed as an agitator in the region and has been quite at pains to make clear that suspending these arms sales won't have a material impact on Israel's security.
The UK continues to support Israel's right to self-defence in accordance with international law. In April, British fighter jets intercepted Iranian missiles aimed at Israel, preventing significant loss of civilian life. We supported robust action against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, and who have attacked Israel directly, as well as Israel-linked shipping. And Iran should be in no doubt of our commitment to challenge their reckless and destabilising activity in the region and across the world.
And Aubrey, what has the reaction been now that this statement has gone out around the world?
So I think initially the reaction was fairly conciliatory, and it's in the detail of this that there has been fallout. I mean, starting with some Labour MPs, I've been speaking to both backbenchers and ministers who are concerned about the timing of this, falling immediately after the 6 hostages who were captured by Hamas were being honoured after having been found dead, their funeral being held this week. But there are those on the left of the Labour Party that feel like the UK should go further and end all arms sales and the licenses for them to Israel indefinitely. And also some Labour backbenchers and ministers feel they question why, for example, the UK is continuing to supply or allowing the supply of sales of arms to Saudi Arabia. So there are concerns about effectively Israel being held to a higher standard, and they fear that this is slightly politically calculated in order to appease those MPs on the left of the party who've been pushing for a softer stance towards Palestine and a stronger stance against Israel for many months now. And certainly on the Conservative side, that is a view that is being expressed much more openly by Andrew Mitchell, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. And Boris Johnson, the former Conservative Prime Minister, has effectively accused Labour of abandoning support for Israel and asked if the government wants Hamas to win. So the pressure is mounting politically, but then you also have community and faith leaders, the Labour Friends of Israel and the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the Chief Rabbi, have all been notably nervous about the signal that this sends. And Israel's Defence Minister has said that he was deeply disheartened at the move.
And ultimately, Aubrey, given that this is 30 out of 350 export licenses just within the UK, and we're not exactly the biggest exporters of arms to Israel, will this actually make a difference to the conflict out there?
It is a very small number. I suppose symbolically, it is much more important. And that's why the UK has been so reticent to move on this issue for many months, because, of course, the death toll in Gaza has been rising, and what this paves the way for elsewhere. Has the UK squared this off with the United States, where Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee for the US presidential candidacy, is much more vocally supportive of Israel and has been at pains not to put herself in the same position as the UK government here has now. And will other countries now feel as though there is pressure to follow suit? Domestically for Keir Starmer, what further potential points might there be where this issue could flare up, either at Labour conference or in opposition motions potentially tabled like by the Scottish National Party, as they did several times in the last year? Those issues haven't gone away. And so while materially this might have a very small, some would say insignificant effect on Israel's ability to defend itself, actually the symbolic and bigger structural repercussions are much greater.
That was Aubrey Allegretti, our chief political correspondent, and George Grylls, defence and political correspondent for The Times. You can read more of their work at thetimes.com with a subscription. And if you want to catch up on some of our coverage of the situation in Israel, then do have a listen back to our recent podcast on why there's talk of a civil war. We'll put a link in the description of this episode. The producer today was Sam Chantarasak. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition are by Mal Lassetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything you heard in this episode or any others, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. We do read every email. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.